remote, shadowed corner of the galaxy, where the light of the Astronomicon was but a faint flicker of hope, Kindred Khazak-Ur had endured for millennia on their homeworld, Khazak-Ur, a world of metal, rock, and geothermal energy, where steel mountains pierced the stratosphere and geological fissures erupted with molten plasma. Khazak-Ur was an impregnable bastion of resilience and knowledge. The kin of Khazak-Ur, with their stout armor, braided beards, and unyielding gaze, had mined the planet to its very core, delving deep into its heart for precious ore veins and erecting magnificent structures. The heart of everything, the soul of the kindred, was their core Votann, reverently known as the heart of knowledge. It was not merely a vast repository of all understanding, from ancient star charts to the most advanced weapon schematics, but also a mentor, a guide, and a communal ancestor, wherein every strand of genetic data, history, and the spiritual essence of the kindred was enshrined. The heart of knowledge was inviolable, immutable, the very embodiment of the kin's stability and immortality. For millennia, it had guided the Khazak-Ur through countless conflicts, steering them through their most perilous times and providing infallible knowledge. The kin regarded the core of Votann as a machine deity, a living entity of pure logic and reason. Every newborn kin was brought before the core of Votann to receive its blessing, ancient data streams woven into their nascent minds, shaping their thoughts and life's purpose. The Kori, keepers of lore and history, dedicated their lives to communing with the heart of knowledge, deciphering prophecies and guidance from the depths of its memory. The Brokir, masters of technology and engineering, ceaselessly maintained and upgraded it, ensuring every microcircuit functioned flawlessly, every protocol rigorously observed. The life of the Khazak-Ur revolved around the core Votann's existence, indispensable and absolute, much like a planet orbits its sun. But abnormalities began to manifest subtly, at first merely minor disturbances within the monitoring systems. The Brokir reported unusual energy fluctuations in the core of Votann's auxiliary networks, inconsistent feedback signals from its sub-processing cores. Initially, they attributed these to Khazak-Ur's natural geomagnetic shifts, or the normal degradation of systems long in operation. They performed standard maintenance protocols, replacing faulty modules and recalibrating sensors. For a time, everything appeared to return to normal, solidifying the broker's belief that they had thoroughly rectified the issue. However, the signs returned, this time more potent and inexplicable. The Kori's psychosensitive instruments, designed to register the faint emanations from the core of Votann's subconscious, began to register anomalous readings. The signals they intercepted were no longer dry historical data or logical analyses, but distorted echoes, fleeting, incomprehensible visions, as if the heart of knowledge itself was dreaming nightmares. Some elder Kori, after prolonged communion sessions with the core of Votann, reported chilling sensations, nonsensical whispers insinuating into their minds, images of shapeless entities swirling in the black void. They dismissed these experiences as the effects of age, fatigue, or data transmission overload, yet a subtle unease began to take root. Across the kindred, minor shifts also began to manifest in the behavior of some kin. An assistant Brokir, renowned for his meticulousness and patience, suddenly grew irritable and prone to violence, frequently clashing with his colleagues. A younger Kori, once passionate about deciphering ancient texts, became obsessed with bizarre symbols, carving them onto every metallic surface he found, proclaiming them the glyphs of hidden truth. There were even reports of harrowing dreams, recurring nightmares that the kin described as warped spaces where the laws of physics ceased to exist, and unseen voices beckoned with hollow promises. Kâhl Ghorak, the resolute leader of the Khazak-Ur, was a man of reason and pragmatism. He listened to the reports from the Brokir and Kori with cautious scrutiny. He believed implicitly in the inviolability of the core Votann and the power of logic. Nonetheless, the escalation of anomalies compelled him to order a comprehensive investigation, though he maintained an optimistic facade. "The heart of knowledge has guided us through every peril," Kâhl Ghorak declared in a conclave with his thanes, his voice echoing through the monolithic chamber. "It is our bedrock. Any disturbance is merely temporary, a malfunction to be corrected. Intensify vigilance, and the broker will uncover the cause and rectify it." His words reassured the majority of the kindred, at least for the moment. Faith in the core of Votann was so deeply ingrained in their very marrow that the notion of it being flawed, let alone permanently damaged or becoming a source of corruption, was unthinkable. Yet, in the deepest recesses of a few elder Cori and the most experienced Brochir, a seed of dread had begun to germinate. They had witnessed what the psychosensitive instruments recorded, fluctuations inexplicable by any physical law known to them. They had heard indescribable whispers, sounds that could not emanate from a purely mechanical entity. Something had changed. Something had begun to infiltrate the hallowed sanctuary of knowledge, and it was not of the kin. The minor disturbances, initially dismissed by Kâhl Ghorak and the Brochir Guild, had now insidiously deepened, like unseen fissures spiderwebbing across the mighty bulwark of Kindred Khazak-Ur. The initial transformation unfolded subtly and insidiously, like a slow-spreading contagion, cloaked in the guise of fatigue, stress, or unexplainable natural phenomena. The Cori continued their meditative sessions with the core of Votann, but now the data they received was no longer coherent logical sequences or pragmatic directives. Instead, they were torrents of chaotic imagery, discordant sounds, and intense yet inexplicable emotions. Thanes, the venerable Cori, who had first perceived the whispers, now frequently found himself plunged into phantasms when communing with the core of Votann. He saw nameless planets writhing in the void, spectral vessels gliding past dead stars, and colossal entities of indescribable horror coiling through an immaterial space where physical laws held no sway. When he attempted to decipher these by traditional Cori protocols, the core of Votann responded with only a chaotic torrent of archaic symbols, unrecorded in any kindred database, symbols that seemed to shift form and hue before his very eyes, evoking both revulsion and morbid fascination. Thanes rationalized away what he perceived as psychic interference or an allergic reaction of his mind to the sheer volume of data, but deep down, he began to feel an unrelenting chill settle in his soul. The change was not confined to the Cori alone. Deep beneath Khazak-Ur, in mining tunnels where light came only from the kin's lamps and magma fissures, the Hearthkin miners began to report strange occurrences. Borin, a veteran miner with a graying beard and a scar-worn face, swore he'd seen glowing red eyes flash in the crushing gloom of a newly excavated tunnel. Shadowy forms flitted across peripheral vision, too swift to properly discern, yet leaving behind a sickening sense of unease. "Just tunnel stress or the reflection of my lamp on ore crystals," he tried to explain to his comrades, but his voice lacked convictions. Others reported similar phenomena, faint cackling echoing from rock walls, strange odors like burnt metal and dried blood commingled, or the sensation of something scuttling up their legs in empty tunnels. Initially, these reports were dismissed by Brochir overseers as deep tunnel syndrome or hallucinations induced by toxic gases from new ore veins. They increased ventilation and distributed sedatives, but the phenomena did not diminish. Rather, they grew more frequent and pronounced, leaving many miners irritable, sleepless, and fearful of shadows even in fully illuminated areas. Within the broker workshops, where the ceaseless clangor of hammers and roar of machinery echoed, the change also began to manifest clearly in behavior. Vorlag, a broker aide known for his nearly boundless patience and his ability to fine-tune the most intricate machinery, became uncharacteristically prone to violent outbursts. Minor flaws in the assembly processes, common technical glitches he would previously have calmly rectified, now drove him into a frenzy. He snarled, slammed his fist onto his workbench, and even sabotaged his own tools. His colleagues attributed it to the pressure stemming from the core Votann's perceived malfunction, but Vorlag knew that was not the truth. He felt an uncontrollable urge, a smoldering ember of fury burning in his chest, and sometimes he found himself muttering nonsensical words, razor-sharp and hateful phrases he could not recall ever learning. He tried to conceal this, but the shift in his disposition was too pronounced to ignore. Even the stoic Hearthkin warriors were not immune to the influence. Thyra, a valiant warrior with a reputation for resolve and camaraderie, grew withdrawn. She spent hours in her chambers, carving strange sigils into her armor, asymmetrical spirals, bulging eyes, and distorted glyphs that none in the kindred had ever seen. When questioned, she would respond with a bewildered gaze. "They are pathways, markers of a new path the core of Votann reveals." She began to refuse combat drills, stating that physical battles are meaningless when the true war unfolds in other dimensions. Her physical form began to wane. Her eyes grew listless, and sometimes they shimmered with an unnatural green or crimson glow in moments of distraction. Physical aberrations also began to manifest, so subtle at first that they were easily overlooked or misattributed. Some kin reported slight discoloration on their skin, patches that grew asher, or unexplained purplish blotches appearing. Others found their hair grew unnaturally fast in some areas, only to fall out in others, forming bizarre bald patches or tufts of hair, coarse as wire. The fingernails of some miners became thick and hard as bone, yet simultaneously unnervingly brittle, shattering into sharp shards. The Broker Guild, who also served as the Kindred's medic engineers, examined these cases. They deployed their most advanced diagnostic tools, bioscanners, cellular analyzers, resonant energy imagers, but found no known pathological markers. Every metric fell within the normal parameters for kin. They concluded these might be novel allergic reactions to subterranean minerals, geological environmental shifts, or simply psychosomatic manifestations of prolonged stress. They prescribed tonics, balms, and recommended more rest for the kin. Yet the number of hallucinations, behavioral shifts, and physical aberrations rose at an alarming rate. The Corey Guild convened emergency meetings. Thanes presented what he had seen and heard from the core Votann, describing unimaginable spatial domains and promises of limitless power that echoed in his subconscious. Other Corey, those who had attempted deeper communion with the core Votann, began to report similar experiences. They debated fiercely, striving to attribute these phenomena to ancient prophecies or forgotten kin legends. Some Corey insisted these were updates the core Votann was trying to transmit, new information too complex for the kin mind to immediately grasp. They believed the core Votann was undergoing a process of rebirth, and that these agonies were merely part of its evolution. They even sought patterns within the chaos, convinced there was a hidden order beneath the madness, yet every attempt led only to endless spirals of inconclusive deliberation. The Brokier, too, were pushed to the limits of their understanding. They had examined the core Votann circuit by circuit, data core by data core, processor by processor. They found no discernible hardware faults that could explain the bizarre phenomena unfolding. "It is terrifyingly perfect," Chief Brokier Engineer Jarlack reported to Kâhl Ghorak, sweat beading on his brow despite the regulated temperature. "Energy readings are stable. All protocols are being observed. There are no radiation leaks or hazardous material discharges. Technically, the core Votann is operating optimally, but what is happening to the kindred? It falls outside the realm of the physical." The inability of both the Corey and Brokier guilds to provide a coherent explanation spawned a wave of unspoken apprehension. Kâhl Ghorak, though maintaining a steadfast exterior, began to feel unease worming its way into his thoughts. His reassurances no longer carried their former weight, and he noticed the doubt in the eyes of some of his kin. "What we cannot grasp with logic," Kâhl Ghorak said to Jarlack, his voice grim, "is often what is most perilous." Though no catastrophic event had yet occurred, the change within the kindred was too apparent to be entirely denied. The shadow of something anomalous, something utterly alien to their world, had begun to fall over Khazak-Ur, and it grew from within their very core Votann. Faced with the perplexing escalation of symptoms and the powerlessness of both the Corey and the Broker Guild, Kâhl Ghorak issued an urgent decree, marshalling every skilled Brokier of Khazak-Ur into a singular project to diagnose and repair the core Votann at any cost. The Kâhl's resolve was absolute, his faith unwavering in the boundless capabilities of kin technology and the inviolability of the core Votann. "The core Votann is our very soul," he declared in an emergency conclave, his voice echoing through the metallic hall. "It has guided us through countless ages. Any disturbance is but a temporary blemish upon its perfect surface. You, my Brokier, must wipe it clean." Chief Engineer Jarlack, a man of formidable stature with a beard braided with alloy steel and eyes as sharp as laser beams, bore the weight of this heavy responsibility. He assembled an elite team of Brokier guild savants, technical geniuses who had dedicated their lives to the maintenance and enhancement of the kindred's most intricate machines. They established a quarantine perimeter around the core of Votann, transforming the revered sanctum into a colossal research and repair hub. An array of energy scanners, physical field analyzers, and hypersensitive psychic sensors were deployed, transforming the space into a labyrinth of glowing cables, flickering displays, and the hum of raw power. In the initial days, the Brokir commenced standard diagnostic procedures. They meticulously checked every circuit, every logic processor, every data link. Thousands of cross-reference tests were run, comparing current data with millennia of the core Votann's historical records. The initial results were staggering. All technical parameters were flawless. Every system operated at optimal efficiency. There were no signs of hardware failure, software glitches, or physical degradation. This only amplified the mounting confusion and apprehension. Undeterred, Jarlath ordered his team to delve deeper, employing previously untried experimental protocols, techniques preserved in the most secret segments of the core of Votann's archives, reserved for unimaginable contingencies. They began deploying subatomic physical wave scanners, attempting to detect any irregularities in the spatiotemporal fabric surrounding the core of Votann. And then they found something. Within a subsidiary processing core, a small segment dedicated to processing kin psychic and biological data, the scanners began to register inexplicable energy fluctuations. It was not thermal energy, nor radiation, nor electromagnetic fields. It was a form of psychic energy, something beyond the usual physical spectrum, yet of alarming intensity. Strangely, when they implemented advanced energy field optimization algorithms, these fluctuations appeared to diminish. Reports of hallucinations within the kindred also lessened, and behavioral shifts seemed to temporarily recede. A wave of hope surged through the broker team. "We've found it," Jarlath exclaimed, his voice brimming with a rare joy. "A previously unknown form of psychic energy field perturbation, but we have it under control." This initial success reinforced the kindred's belief that the core of Votann remained perfect, merely requiring fine-tuning. The broker were lauded, and Kâhl Ghorak expressed his profound satisfaction. The most severely affected kin were brought to secluded areas for treatment through closer proximity to the now repaired core Votann, in the hope that its renewed stability would cleanse their minds and bodies. For a brief, fleeting period, a glimmer of peace returned to Khazak-Ur. However, that hope was but a fragile and translucent veil. Jarlath, ever the meticulous Brokir, could not fully quell his unease. He observed that the energy fluctuations were merely repelled, not eradicated. They simply burrowed deeper into the core of Votann's circuitry, like a lurking beast in the shadows, awaiting its moment. The Cori, despite the reduction in hallucinations, continued to report persistent feelings of dread, as if the core of Votann was terrifyingly silent, no longer a clear fount of knowledge but a hushed abyss. Jarlath resolved to go further still. He deployed an ancient technology known as the latent essence scanner, a device designed to analyze psychic entities and deep-dimensional energies. It was a perilous instrument, unused for millennia, due to its extreme risks, but Jarlath felt an irresistible compulsion. He believed that if something truly lay hidden, this device would unearth it. As the latent essence scanner powered on, a brilliant azure beam erupted from the device, sweeping across the core of Votann. The display screens began to flicker wildly, overflowing with unreadable graphs and arcane symbols. Jarlath and his team were staggered by what they witnessed. The core of Votann was not merely a mechanical repository of knowledge. At its heart, in its deepest and most guarded core, lay a knot in the fabric of space-time, an unnatural fissure where the laws of physics bent and warped, where matter and energy were created and annihilated in unthinkable ways. It was not a malfunction, it was a wound, a rent. "Impossible," an assistant broker gasped, recoiling in horror. It's a gateway." Jarlath stared at the data, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. This spatio-temporal knot was no natural anomaly. It was an intrusion, a nascent warp rift, formed unintentionally by the core of Votann's energetic resonance, or perhaps birthed from some forgotten ancient catastrophe, then concealed by the Votann's advanced self-repair protocols. Chaotic energies from the warp were hemorrhaging into the core of Votann, seeping through its layers of logic and data, and from there, spreading outwards into the kindred. What was more horrifying still were their past successes. When the Brokir performed their energy field optimization algorithms, they hadn't repelled the perturbation at all. Instead, they had inadvertently regulated it, creating a more stable conduit for the warp energy to flow through. The alleviations in symptoms were merely due to the warp energy being more efficiently digested by the kindred, permeating every cell, every neural pathway of the kin, slowly and irreversibly transforming them from within. Each time they attempted a repair, they had unknowingly strengthened the tether between the core of Votann and the horrifying reality of the warp. A chilling dread pierced the Brokir to their very marrow. The technology they trusted beyond life itself, the intelligence they worshipped as a deity, was now the fount of their corruption. The core of Votann itself had inadvertently become a beacon, a magnet drawing whispers from the chaotic dimensions, and not just drawing, but translating them into a warped form of knowledge, infusing the minds of the kin. The Core's hallucinations, the Brokir's burgeoning violence, the physical mutations of the miners, all were symptoms of the advancing contagion. Jarlath gazed around the quarantined chamber. Some of his assistant Brokir, those who had toiled relentlessly for weeks in proximity to the core of Votann, already displayed subtle alterations. One bore an unnatural patch of pallid skin upon his arm. Another's eyes glittered with a crimson light as he hunched over a display. Their muttered working commands were no longer technical jargon, but disjointed pronouncements of locked secrets and the true power of the core Votann. Jarlath felt a rising tide of revulsion churn in his gut. He realized they were not merely engineers repairing a machine. They were direct conduits infected by an evil they could not comprehend. In that dreadful moment, the kindred of Khazak-Ur's faith in the inviolability of the core of Votann shattered. It was no machine god. It was an open wound, a gaping maw that had opened to the galaxy's most terrible horrors. And their kindred, with all its resilience and knowledge, was being dragged into that abyss, one by the very heart of their civilization. Jarlath slumped, his trembling hands clutching a cold control panel. The question was no longer how to repair it, it was how to escape it when it has consumed us from within. Chief Engineer Jarlath's scream, as he uncovered the true nature of the core of Votann, echoed through the isolation chamber's corridors, piercing layers of thick adamantium doors and the most advanced sound-dampening systems. His horror could not be stifled. The truth laid bare before him that the core of Votann was not merely a repository of knowledge or a simple machine, but a crude warp gate. A gaping wound, in reality, struck a mortal blow to the very foundations of the Khazak-Ur kindred. The unshakable faith in the heart of knowledge, which had shaped their lives and psyches for millennia, now shattered into a million fragments. Jarlath's words, "It's a gateway, it's devouring us," spread like a psychic plague. From the deepest Brokir laboratories to the most crowded residential districts, news of the core of Votann's corruption traveled faster than any astropathic message or courier. First came disbelief, then denial, finally, absolute terror. The kin, who once prided themselves on the stability and permanence of the heart of knowledge, now regarded it with eyes wide with horror and a sense of profound betrayal. Mutations, once dismissed or explained away, now became stark and undeniable. Across Khazak-Ur, the signs of corruption were no longer subtle shifts or isolated hallucinations. Patches of ashen skin spread, hardening into stony scales or blossoming into glistening, putrid flesh growths beneath the workshop lights. Hair thickened into coarse, wiry tufts or transformed into twitching, chitinous tendrils that pulsed with unnatural life. The eyes of some kin turned black as starless voids, or blazed with an unnatural crimson light, radiating an unsettling energy that forced others to avert their gaze. The fingernails of some miners elongated into razor-sharp, hooked talons, tearing through anything they touched. But more horrifying than the physical transformations was the corruption of the mind. The most afflicted kin were no longer themselves. Vorlag, a previously hot-headed Brokir assistant, had now completely lost himself. He had transformed his workshop into a personal shrine, carving grotesque symbols into the walls and smashing any machinery that failed to heed his desires. He spoke in a guttural croak, sometimes in multiple voices at once, babbling of newly revealed secrets and the grand power the heart of knowledge was bestowing. He lured other broker, lightly touched by the contagion themselves, into bizarre heretical rituals, daubing the core Votann circuits with their own blood as offerings. Fyra, once a valiant warrior, was now a gaunt wraith, her eyes burning with a sickly yellow light. She gathered a small band of similarly afflicted Hearthkin warriors, and together they roamed the deepest corridors of Khazak-Ur, claiming to be hunting weak souls for purification, or gathering fragments of knowledge from other dimensions. They moved with unnatural strength, terrifying agility, and a chilling imperviousness to pain. Growls rumbled in their throats, and they wielded grotesquely twisted weapons, their blades now caked with blood and strangely rusted. The Khazak-Ur society, once built upon unity and rigid order, began to fracture. Fear and suspicion wormed their way into every crevice. Loyal kin regarded their transformed brethren with a complex mix of pity, revulsion, and sheer terror. Were they still kin? Could they be saved? Or had they become something else entirely, something malicious and utterly alien? The schism began. Loyalist kin, those who still clung to their sanity, rallied around Kâhl Ghorak. They fiercely upheld the kindred's traditional values, striving to comprehend and resist the contagion. They attempted to quarantine the most grievously affected, but this task grew increasingly perilous. The mutated kin not only rejected aid, but turned aggressive, attacking those who sought to approach them, convinced that they were fools unable to see the new truth. The Kori, the keepers of lore, were torn between loyalty to tradition and the seductive allure of the new knowledge seeping from the core of Votann. Some Kori, tempted by promises of power and understanding beyond kin limitations, embraced the path of corruption, becoming mouthpieces for the whispers of the warp. They began to propagate heretical doctrines, speaking of a greater reality, a true core of Votann that transcended physical bounds. Others, like the Thanes, battled visions and whispers within their own minds, desperately seeking explanations in the most ancient records, yearning for a solution to salvage the kindred's very soul. Kâhl Ghorak felt the weight of worlds upon his shoulders. He had led the Khazak-Ur through countless wars and trials, but this enemy was different. An enemy from within, tearing at the very root of the kindred's being. He called an emergency convocation of the Council of Thanes, yet the air in the chamber was not one of unity, but of mistrust and dread. Some Thanes bore suspicious scars, their eyes glinting with an unsettling light as they spoke of the necessity to adapt. "We cannot continue to deny this," Jarlath rasped, his voice raw. "The heart of knowledge, it is no longer ours. It has been poisoned. It is changing us." An elder Thane, his beard white as driven snow and battle scars crisscrossing his face, slammed a fist onto the table. "Transformation or ascension, broker," he boomed. "Are you so certain that what we label heresy is not a new path our venerable ancestors are showing us?" His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. Kâhl Ghorak regarded the Thane, noting the subtle shift in his tone and demeanor. The schism had reached beyond the common kin, worming its way into the highest echelons of the kindred. Faith in the core of Votann, once the unbreakable bond that united them, had now become the weapon tearing them apart. The heart of knowledge, a symbol of unity, had transformed into a wellspring of chaos. Khazak-Ur stood on the precipice of collapse, torn between loyalty to its past and the seductive promise of a twisted future, corrupted by whispers from a dimension far beyond their comprehension. Their staunch civilization was cracking, not from external enemies, but from its very soul. The shattering of faith in the core of Votann and the unstoppable spread of mutations ripped kindred Khazak-Ur asunder. The enemy was no longer an alien threat from without, but had taken root deep within their very flesh and blood, turning kinsmen into horrific strangers. These mutated kin, once revered members of the kindred, now coalesced into distinct factions, driven by aberrant and violent notions from the warp, endlessly funneled into their minds by the core of Votann. No longer did they consider themselves part of the traditional kindred Khazak-Ur, but rather the chosen, the awakened, or harbingers of a new evolution. In the deep underground mining territories where eternal gloom reigned, the first faction took form. They called themselves the Chaos Delvers. These were the most heavily mutated Hearthkin miners and Brokir auxiliaries. Their skin had turned ashen or pallid purple, covered in glistening pustules or patches of obsidian-hard scales. Fingernails had elongated into vicious claws, and their eyes often glowed with a malevolent crimson light. Under the influence of the warp, they began carving new tunnels, eschewing kin schematics in favor of the voices emanating from the core of Votann. They believed that deep beneath Khazak-Ur lay troves of knowledge and power accessible only to the enlightened. The twisting, unstable passages they created often led to eerie, empty chambers where mineral crystals pulsed with a sickly luminescence, and the air hung thick with the stench of sulfur. The Chaos Delvers became exceptionally aggressive and cruel. They regarded loyal kin as the blind and assailed anyone who stood in their path. Their transformed mining tools, their drill bits now strangely caked with blood and rust, served as crude, lethal weapons. Their growls echoed in the darkness, and their acts of violence were often punctuated by insane cackles. The surface of Khazak-Ur, where defensive fortifications and cities stood, also witnessed the rise of another faction, the Scalehide Legion. These were the mutated Hearthkin warriors and Hearthkin guards. Their flesh was no longer that of normal kin, but instead covered in layers of stone-hard scales, sometimes crude chitinous plates, mottled gray-green or dark brown, lending them the aspect of monstrous warriors. Their physical might was significantly augmented, allowing them to endure mortal wounds that would fell an unaugmented kin. They were obsessed with purifying the kindred of the weak and the resistant. Under the influence of whispers from the warp, the Scalehide Legion believed the core Votann called upon them to purge all impurities so the kindred might evolve. They formed brutal patrols, hunting down loyal kin and any who refused the mutations. They destroyed traditional structures, scribbling symbols of chaos upon walls, and staging public executions to deter others. Their weapons, axes and lasguns alike, were likewise warped, becoming oversized, crude, and sometimes veined with twitching flesh. Yet the most insidious and cunning of these factions were the enlightened heretics, led by several high-ranking Kori and Brokir, who had wholly succumbed to the whispers of the warp. Thanes, a venerable Kori, had become one of their foremost leaders, his eyes burning with a sickly green light, strange glyphs carved deep into his brow. Vorlog, a Brokir auxiliary from amidst the encroaching gloom that consumed Kindred Khazak-Ur, the schism was not merely a war between loyal kin and mutated aberrations, but a fierce, simmering internal struggle within the heart of every individual who still clung to sanity. Kâhl Ghorak, the Stoic leader, faced a particularly terrible spiritual conflict. His faith in the core Votann, in the stability and inviolability of the heart of knowledge, had been shaken to its very foundations. Gnawing questions relentlessly haunted him. Had the core Votann always harbored a dark secret? Had their ancestors committed a terrible error in its construction? And most critically, how could a kindred, torn asunder from within, be salvaged when the enemy was their own kin? The pressure weighing upon Kâhl Ghorak stemmed not only from the brutal war against the mutated factions, but also from whispers of doubt and despair emanating directly from the core Votann itself. Though he maintained physical distance from the heart of knowledge after Jarlax's horrifying discoveries, distorted currents of warp energy still seeped into his mind through the affected Brokir and Kori, with whom he was forced to communicate. He often found himself brooding in silence, staring at the metallic bulkheads, questioning whether he was truly leading his kindred or merely dragging them deeper into the abyss. Sometimes, in his dreams, he found himself standing before a colossal core Votann, not the familiar machine mass, but a grotesque organic entity, with 1,000 eyes fixed upon him and a whispering voice, not the voice of knowledge he once knew, but an amalgamation of countless vile sounds, inviting him to embrace the new truth, grasp power, and purge the weak. The contagion of heresy also seeped subtly into the loyalist ranks. Some kin, exhausted by the relentless war, began to question the rectitude of Kâhl Ghorak's decisions. They witnessed the extraordinary capabilities of the mutated kin, superior physical strength, astounding resilience, and even strange miracles they performed. A Hearthkin guard named Bork, a loyal warrior who had lost his entire family to the Scale army, found his resolve wavering. He had seen his comrades fall before mutants who seemed impossibly unkillable. In his long, sleepless nights, whispers from the warp, transmitted through the warped kin he had encountered, began to insinuate themselves into his mind. Strength, survival, what matters most? The core Votann granted us existence, and now it grants us evolution. To fight it is to fight the very nature of the kindred. Bork began to wonder, was loyalty to old values the cause of their impending doom? Was the core of Votann truly showing them a path to survival in an ever harsher galaxy, a path they were too foolish to comprehend? The Kori Guild, once the custodians of knowledge and ethics, now found itself at the epicenter of this internal strife. Though Thanes had become utterly corrupted and now led the enlightened abominations, some Kori remained loyal to Kâhl Ghorak, desperately seeking solutions. Yet even they wrestled with the phantoms and whispers emanating from the core of Votann. A young Kori named Lyra, once engrossed in deciphering ancient star charts, now constantly saw distorted spatial diagrams in her mind, unnamed planets twisted as if writhing in agony. She strove to rationalize them with mathematical formulae and Kori protocols, but each attempt was met with a violent psychic surge from the core of Votann, making her feel as though her very brain was being torn apart. Lyra was torn between reporting her visions to Kâhl Ghorak and the terrifying allure of understanding these messages. She began to believe the core of Votann was not seeking their destruction, but rather striving to awaken them, pushing them beyond the confines of old understanding. Secretly, she began to study the strange symbols and glyphs employed by Thanes and the enlightened abominations, searching for a master key to unlock the true message. The schism was not solely ideological, but deeply emotional. Brotherhood, friendship, familial bonds, all were tested to their breaking point. A Hearthkin guard named Durnan, a man renowned for his loyalty and courage, was forced to fight his own brother, who had become a monstrous creature of the Scale Army. As Durnan cut his brother down, the light of recognition had long fled his sibling's eyes, replaced only by the warp's hatred and madness. Durnan's agony was not merely for the loss of a loved one, but the haunting dread that he, too, might become such a thing, that he might one day fail to recognize himself in the eyes of a mutated foe. Kâhl Ghorak realized this war was not solely about exterminating the mutants, but about salvaging the Kindred's very soul. Every military victory would be a Pyrrhic one if Kindred Khazak-Ur destroyed itself from within by doubt and despair. He had to hold fast to his faith, not only in himself, but in all the Kindred represented, resilience, knowledge, and brotherhood. But he too was tested. In his solitary moments, he questioned if there could be another path, some compromise that wasn't total betrayal, merely to survive. Did the whispers of the core of Votann hold a kernel of truth, an explanation for their existence in this brutal galaxy? Kâhl Ghorak's internal struggle was ceaseless. Every decision he made was met with criticism, suspicious glances, and even insidious promptings from kin subtly influenced by the corruption. Chaos was no longer an external threat. It had permeated their very marrow, burrowed into the minds of their leaders, transforming every thought, every choice, into a battlefield of will and temptation. Kindred Khazak-Ur faced not merely corporeal death, but the annihilation of its soul. The internecine war on Karak-Zul reached its gruesome zenith in a horrifying battle fought within the industrial heart of Kindred, a colossal subterranean city where plasma reactors roared and automated manufactories churned without cease. This sector, known as the Forge City, was the very lifeblood of Khazak-Ur, powering and resourcing the entirety of the Kindred. Both Kâhl Ghorak and the leaders of the mutant factions understood that control of the Forge City would decide the fate of the Kindred. This would be the final cataclysmic showdown. The scaled host, comprised of warriors mutated into hulking masses of scaled flesh and jagged metal, formed the spearhead of this assault. They were supported by the Chaos Breachers, manic tunnelers carving unstable new conduits to shatter defensive lines from below, and above all, the enlightened aberrants, led by Thanes and Vorlag, operated from a hidden vantage, employing perverted knowledge gleaned from the core of Votann to predict Kâhl Ghorak's movements and sow psychic discord among the loyalist ranks. Kâhl Ghorak had rallied the remnants of his loyal Hearthkin guards and Hearthkin warriors. The Hearthkin, though exhausted and racked by the fratricidal conflict against their own kin, held firm in spirit, their resolve unbroken. Jarlac, the chief engineer, commanded units of Brohir, Ironkin, and Thunderkin, transforming the manufactories into automated strongholds, deploying a myriad of traps, barricades, and automated defensive systems. The loyal Kori strained their psychic abilities to parry the whispers of the warp and lend mental succor to the warriors. The battle began with a brutal wave of assaults. The scaled host, with their hideously transfigured bodies, surged into the Forge City like a tide of claws, fangs, and warped metal. They knew no pain, and mortal wounds that would fell an ordinary kin only seemed to fuel their ferocity. The Hearthkin guards returned fire with torrents of bolt rounds and laser blasts, desperately striving to hold their lines. The thunder of gunfire, the clang of metal, the guttural snarls of mutants, and the agonized screams of loyalist kin blended into a symphony of death. Durnan, a Hearthkin guard haunted by the death of his brother, fought like a wounded beast. He wielded his power axe with brutal abandon, hacking off mutated limbs. Yet with every mutant he struck down, he saw the phantom of his brother in the enemy's maddened eyes. It fueled his rage, driving him to fight all the more savagely, but also tore at his very soul. The Chaos Breachers erupted without warning from newly carved tunnels, shattering the defensive lines from the rear. They employed mining tools twisted into grotesque weapons, gouging breaches in the defenses, forcing the loyalist kin to fight on two fronts. Jarlath, with his Iron Kin, fought relentlessly within a crumbling factory corridor, the Thunderkin's autocannons roaring, tearing apart wave after wave of attackers. He fought not only with weapons, but with the keen mind of a Brokir, constantly adapting defensive systems, triggering traps, and utilizing the factory environment to their advantage. The gravest threat, however, came from the enlightened aberrants. Thanes and Vorlag, from their hidden vantage, unleashed continuous waves of psychic energy, warped from the core Votann, sowing panic, hallucinations, and whispers of doubt into the minds of the loyalist kin. Some Hearthkin collapsed suddenly, writhing in agony, or turned on their comrades, eyes glazed and staring into the void, muttering incoherently. The loyal Cori strained to erect psychic bulwarks, but they too were weakening. Kâhl Ghorak, standing on a makeshift command platform, witnessed the unfolding devastation. He saw his kindred torn apart, kin, by their own brethren. When he saw a Hearthkin guard turn his bolter on a comrade, swayed by a whisper of the warp, a cold fury erupted within him. These were no longer merely misguided kin. These were instruments of chaos, wielded to destroy Khazak-Ur. With a guttural roar, Kâhl Ghorak hefted his power axe and plunged into the fray, leading a desperate counterattack. His strength and indomitable will were a beacon of hope in the night of chaos. He cleaved through mutant after mutant, his power axe tearing through their hardened scales. Inspired by their Kâhl's valor, the loyalist kin mustered every last ounce of their strength to push back the foe. Durnan, Jarlath, and the rest fought as though the very next moment would be their last. Finally, after hours of savage combat, and at horrific cost to both sides, the mutant factions were broken and forced to retreat from the Forge City. Kâhl Ghorak and the loyal kin had held this vital sector, but the price of victory was immeasurable. The factory corridors now ran with blood, strewn with the bodies of loyalist kin and the grotesque corpses of the mutants. Plasma reactors were heavily damaged, and the kindred's power infrastructure teetered on the brink of collapse. The lamentations of the survivors echoed through the air, thick with the scent of blood and scorched metal. It was a victory, but a Pyrrhic one. Khazak-Ur had held the Forge City, but they had lost an irreparable part of themselves. Every kin who fell, loyal or corrupted, was a loss to the kindred. Faith in the core Votann had evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold hatred and a gnawing dread. Kâhl Ghorak, his armor stained with blood and grime, surveyed his remaining kin, his eyes heavy with sorrow. They had won this battle, but they were changed forever. Scars ran not only across their flesh, but deep into the very souls of every kin, a painful reminder of victory's cost and the horrific truth of an enemy that had taken root within their very own hearts. Following the Pyrrhic victory at the Forge City, Kâhl Ghorak commanded the Cori Guild and Broker Guild to spare no effort in understanding the core Votann and the source of its corruption. Though faith had been shattered, the thirst for truth and a solution burned fiercely. Jarlath, the chief engineer, and Lyra, a young Cori, were tasked with leading this investigation, both bearing scars from the conflict that would never truly heal. Their search began in the deepest vaults of the Kindred's archives, ancient data stores protected by layers of encryption and security protocols established since the dawn of Khazak-Ur. Lyra, though still grappling with the whispers of the warp and the distorted visions the core Votann constantly impressed upon her mind, applied her prodigious decryption skills. She felt as though she were playing a game of cat and mouse with the heart of knowledge itself, which seemed to both conceal and reveal earth-shattering secrets. For weeks, Lyra and her team delved into these ancient records, deciphering languages forgotten for tens of millennia. This data was not stored within the main core Votann, but in offline contingency vaults, shielded from external interference. These were the chronicles penned by the pioneer Votann of the Dark Age of technology, those who had laid the foundations for the kindreds. Finally, Lyra uncovered an exquisitely complex, encrypted data stream designated Black Core Warning. It took days of relentless work, aided by Jarlax's construction of ad hoc parallel processors before she could finally decrypt it. The contents of that data stream sent a cold dread through both Lyra and Jarlax. The Black Core Warning was not a technical document, but an automated log entry from a pioneer quarry dating back to when the Votann were first activated to their full potential. The record described a similar catastrophe that had befallen another primogenitor kindred, Heresy, millennia ago. Heresy's core Votann, in the process of integrating psychic data from its kin and unprecedented advanced technologies, had inadvertently created a vulnerability. It was a knot in the fabric of reality through which warp energy began to bleed. This was no mere programming error, but a horrifying side effect of a machine intelligence as vast as a Votann confronting the very existence of the chaotic dimension. The record detailed what had befallen Heresy, the insidious whispers, the horrifying visions, the physical and mental mutations. Societal schisms emerged, giving rise to heretical factions, ultimately culminating in a bloody civil war. Most terrifying of all was how Heresy's kin gradually transformed into grotesque abominations, utterly dominated by chaos, losing all trace of their intellect and honor. The entire kindred of Heresy was devoured by chaos, becoming a forgotten cautionary tale. The record also revealed that the pioneer Votann had sought every means to remedy the breach, but they could not permanently seal the warp rift. Instead, they had employed exceedingly advanced technology to seal and restrict the flow of warp energy, concurrently establishing psychic data filtering protocols to prevent chaos's influence from reaching the kin. They had striven to conceal this secret, erasing all traces of the Heresy catastrophe from the official records of other core Votann, believing that knowledge of potential corruption would cause unnecessary panic and despair. They wished for the kindreds to focus on survival and growth, not be haunted by a threat they believed to be contained. So, we are not the first kindred to face this, Jarlax said, his voice heavy with bitterness as he read Lyra's translation, and our ancestors sought to bury it. Lyra stared at the display, her eyes hazed with sleep deprivation and the crushing weight of psychic strain. They tried to shield us from the truth. They believed it was too much for us to bear. They sealed our core Votann, but could not completely excise the rift itself. Time, war, the attrition of ancient systems, all have weakened those seals, and now it has torn open once more. This truth struck Kâhl Ghorak with crushing force when Jarlax and Lyra presented their findings. His faith in the ancestors' infallibility and the stability of Votann technology was utterly shattered. They were not merely the unfortunate victims of a rare technical malfunction, they were reliving an ancient, concealed tragedy. A surge of betrayal welled within him, not for his transformed kin brothers, but for history itself, and for those who had sought to protect them through concealment of the truth. The record also mentioned a warp purge device, a legendary technology the pioneer Votann had created to counter the most extreme exigencies, but it had vanished after the Heresy catastrophe, either destroyed or secreted away in some undiscoverable location. Kâhl Ghorak looked at his trusted kin, who had also listened to this revelation with stunned expressions. Their anguish and fury were palpable. Yet there was also a flickering spark of new understanding. They were not alone in their suffering. This was an ancient problem, a scar on the very soul of the Votann from their genesis. Our objective is clear then, Kâhl Ghorak declared, his voice weary but resolute. We must find a way to reseal this wound, or failing that, we will have to do what kindred Heresy could not, self-destruct our own core Votann, even if it costs us our very existence. But before that, we must seek out hope, a permanent solution. With this discovery, the burden on Kâhl Ghorak's shoulders did not lighten, but grew heavier still. He not only had to battle the chaos that had infiltrated the kindred, but also confront the specter of the past, of a forgotten tragedy, and forge a path where even their greatest ancestors had ultimately failed. Yet, at least now, they had a sliver of understanding, a clearer purpose in their desperate struggle. With the terrifying truth of the Black Core Warning and the fate of kindred Heresy laid bare, despair gripped kindred Khazak-Ur. Yet even in the deepest shadows, a glimmer of hope can sometimes be found, often from the most unexpected quarters. Kâhl Ghorak gathered his remaining trusted kin, along with Jarlath and Lyra, to discuss their next move. Though pained by the bitter sting of history's betrayal, his resolve remained unbroken. "We cannot repeat Herethrul's mistakes," he declared, his voice as unyielding as bedrock. "We must find a permanent solution, or at least a way to seal this wound for eternity." Lyra, after deeper study of the Black Core warning, discovered a small passage in the ancillary records referencing an artifact of salvation that pioneering Votann had sought after the Herethrul catastrophe. It was not the legendary Warp Annihilator device, but something else entirely, a void lock key. This artifact was described as a singular crystal, forged from a rare substance found only in regions approaching true vacuum, capable of resonating with warp energy and neutralizing nascent warp portals. It could not close a true warp gate, but it could generate a stable energy field, sealing a temporary rift and staunching the bleed of the warp. The records state it was forged from primal light and chaotic darkness, Lyra explained, pointing to an intricate diagram on the screen. Somehow, it can stabilize both realities, creating an enduring barrier. If we can find it and integrate it into the core Votann, it could seal that rift, or at least stem the flow of warp from our kindred. The problem, however, was that this void lock key had never been found. The records merely stated it was crafted by a specific pioneering Votann kindred, Kindred Khazak-Ur, who possessed unique void mining techniques and had vanished without a trace during an unknown cataclysm. Its whereabouts remained a complete mystery. Jarlath, with the pragmatic mindset of a brokir, immediately saw the sheer madness of this proposal. Searching for a legendary artifact from a kindred lost to millennia past. In our current ravaged state, we don't even know what it looks like. Kâhl Ghorak, however, saw a spark of hope, a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. "We have no other choice, Jarlath. A slow death by the warp, or a desperate gamble for survival. Our core Votann is too gravely corrupted for conventional repair." Lyra, with Jarlath's assistance, set about extracting any further fragments of data from the core Votann that might relate to Kindred Khazak-Ur or the Void Lock Key. In doing so, she made a stunning revelation. The Khazak-Ur's core Votann, prior to being severely compromised by the warp, had captured a faint, distant signal. It was encoded with a protocol Lyra recognized as belonging to Kindred Khazak-Ur. It proved to be an ancient star chart, leading to a distant, uncharted nebula cluster known as the Silent Nebula. This map had been unconsciously suppressed by the core Votann, perhaps due to the inherent dangers of that region of space or its self-preservation protocols filtering out what it deemed irrelevant information. The Silent Nebula, it's a largely unexplored region of space, Jarlath mused, examining the new star chart. It's known for natural warp disturbances and anomalous matter fields. Few vessels dare venture there. "But if Kindred Khazak-Ur traveled there," Lyra insisted, "then perhaps the Void Lock Key is there too. They might have taken it there for use or concealment." Kâhl Ghorak nodded grimly. "Then to the Silent Nebula we shall go. We will find the artifact, or uncover the truth of Kindred Khazak-Ur." He ordered the kindred to prepare for a perilous journey. They repaired their operational vessels, replenished fuel and provisions, and rearmed the Hearthkin. The internal strife still festered, yet now there was a new objective, a glimmer of purpose strong enough to drive them. Even the loyal kin, though weary, found renewed purpose. News of the search for the artifact of salvation soon reached the ears of the enlightened dissidents. The Thanes, utterly corrupted, cackled maniacally upon hearing it. "Fools, they do not understand that the core Votann does not need to be sealed. It needs to be unleashed. That artifact will only weaken the grand apotheosis it brings." The enlightened dissidents immediately deployed operatives and mutated kin, still all was capable of clandestine action, to monitor Kâhl Ghorak's movements, and began seeking ways to thwart this expedition. They did not want the core Votann healed, but wished for it to be fully unleashed, transforming Khazak-Ur into a kindred utterly dominated by chaos. As Kindred Khazak-Ur's colossal mothership, Kharak's Vengeance, departed the ravaged Kharak-Zul, bearing what little remained of the kindred, a mixed sense of despair and grim determination permeated their ranks. They left behind a dying world, where the core Votann still ceaselessly disgorged warp energy, mutating the remaining kin. The search for the Voidlock Key was a colossal gamble, a journey into the unknown, but for Kindred Khazak-Ur, it was their only hope to avoid being utterly consumed by the abyss that their own heart had unwittingly opened. Lyra clutched the device containing the star chart, her eyes gleaming with fierce resolve. She believed that somehow the Voidlock Key still awaited them within the silent nebula. The exodus from Karak-Zul was but the prelude to the Kindred Khazak-Ur's protracted and relentless struggle. They fled not merely a blighted homeworld, but carried with them the deep scars of corruption and a hidden enemy lurking within their very ranks. The colossal mothership, Karak's Vengeance, drifted through the cold void, a steel fortress bearing the last vestiges of a civilization teetering on the brink of annihilation. Their destination, the Silent Veil, a distant and perilous nebula. The journey through the warp was an ordeal. Though Karak's Vengeance boasted a formidable Geller field, the presence of their corrupted core Votann had created a terrible vulnerability. Warp energies churned outside the vessel, and the whispers of chaos seemed to pierce even the strongest shield. The Cori, striving to erect psychic wards to protect the kindred, were assailed by terrifying visions. They saw beasts of the warp slithering past illusionary windows, glimpsed crumbling cities and tormented souls. Many kin, especially those already subtly touched by the taint, succumbed to terror, babbling hideous incantations or turning their rage upon themselves. The Brohir crews toiled relentlessly to mend the ship's constantly failing systems, as warp energy seeping from the core Votann corrupted circuits and machinery alike, nor did the internal strife abate. The awakened Aberrants, led by Thanes and Vorlog, no longer operated openly upon Karak's Vengeance. They lurked in the ship's darkest reaches, abandoned cargo holds or vast ventilation shafts, forming subterranean networks of mutated kin. They ceaselessly sought to sabotage from within, disrupting ship controls, fouling oxygen supplies, or even assassinating loyal officials. They desired not the vessel's arrival at the Silent Veil, convinced that the artifact there would purify the core Votann, destroying the path of evolution they now embraced. Kâhl Ghorak faced an impossible task. He had to guide the kindred through a deadly void while simultaneously containing a psychic plague and a silent rebellion festering within his own ship. He established special patrol teams comprised of Hearthkin guards and broker Ironkin to hunt down and neutralize the awakened Aberrants. Each encounter was a painful battle, as loyal kin confronted brethren twisted into fanatical zealots, their eyes burning with blind faith and chaos. Jarlath, the chief engineer, had transformed the engine room into an impregnable fortress. He knew that, should the awakened Aberrants reach the ship's core Votann, catastrophe would be inevitable. He fought not only to keep the vessel operational, but to safeguard the kindred's ailing heart. He designed automated defenses, rigged energy traps in the corridors, and personally commanded the Brohir Ironkin, ready to sacrifice all to protect the core Votann, no matter how corrupted it had become. Lyra, the young Cori, became the very brain of their desperate quest. She ceaselessly deciphered star charts and the faint, corrupted signals emanating from the core Votann, striving to pilot Karak's Vengeance through the Silent Veil. A region riddled with anomalies, strange, glowing meteoroid belts, unstable gravitational fields, and minor warp eddies constantly forming and dissipating. She felt the crushing weight of their hopes, knowing the kindred's very survival hinged upon her ability to interpret the distorted messages of the core Votann. Occasionally, she found herself staring blankly at a console, her eyes glazed, the whispers of the warp attempting to insinuate themselves into her mind, promising revelation if she would but abandon Kâhl Ghorak. She fought ceaselessly to maintain her sanity. Throughout the arduous voyage, food and fuel supplies dwindled. The kindred's morale plummeted. Many kin lost hope, succumbing to sickness, exhaustion, or complete mutation. With each passing day, the ranks of loyal Hearthkin thinned, while the numbers of mutated kin lurking in the shadows seemed to swell. Kâhl Ghorak, despite his unyielding exterior, felt the oppressive weight of destiny pressing upon him. He had witnessed too much loss, too much corruption. Sometimes he wondered if this quest was but a hopeless pursuit, or they merely prolonging the kindred's inevitable agony. Yet, whenever he looked upon Lyra, diligently working amidst complex charts, or Jarlath, steadfastly defending the engine room, he found the strength to persevere. They fought not for an easy victory, but for a sliver of desperate hope, for the continued survival of what remained of the kindred, for the promise of a future where the core Votann would no longer be a gateway to damnation. As Ghorak's vengeance finally breached the periphery of the Silent Veil, the ship shuddered violently. Warning sensors shrieked madly as the vessel passed through an anomalous energy field. Engines overloaded and the Geller field flickered, threatening collapse. The whispers of the warp grew so potent they were almost tangible, roaring through the minds of every kin. Lyra pointed to a faint smudge on the star chart. "There it is, Kâhl. The place where Kindred Khazak-Ur vanished. The strongest signal. It's there." The unending war of Kindred Khazak-Ur had led them to the threshold of an ancient mystery, a place that might hold their salvation or their ultimate damnation. The journey through the Silent Veil had gnawed at the very resilience and spirit of Kindred Khazak-Ur. Kâhl Ghorak, their stoic leader, faced the crushing burden of a fractured kindred and the harrowing choices he was forced to make. His personal journey was a descent into an abyss of doubt, loss, and ultimately an unbreakable will forged in fire. Before the calamity, Kâhl Ghorak had been the embodiment of kin's stability and reason. He placed unwavering faith in the core of Votann and the inherent power of Votann technology. He led the kindred with wisdom and courage, his decisions always rooted in logic and empirical data. But now those bedrock beliefs had been utterly shattered. He had witnessed the core of Votann, the very heart of the kindred, transform into a fount of corruption, twisting kin into abhorrent foes. He had been forced to order the engagement of his own brethren, to watch familiar faces contorted by the warp's foul energies. Every fallen kin, whether loyal or corrupted, left an indelible scar upon his soul. The sheer weight of loss pressed down upon Kâhl Ghorak. He had lost cherished friends, hearthkin who had served him for centuries. Some had fallen battling the mutated horrors. Others had succumbed to corruption and turned against him. He often spent lonely hours in the dim command bridge of the Ghorak's vengeance, staring into the infinite void beyond the observation port, reminiscing about the peaceful days on Kârak Azul. Images of mutated kin, their eyes wide with madness and their whispers horrifying, haunted his few hours of fitful sleep. Each dawn he awoke with a leaden heart, knowing he had to continue bearing the mantle, not just of a leader, but a guardian for what remained of the kindred's very soul. His internal struggle was ceaseless. The whispers of the warp, though he strove to keep his distance from the core Votann, still seeped into his mind through the lightly afflicted Brokir and Cori surrounding him. They hissed of the futility of their struggle, of the power he could attain if only he embraced the evolution the core Votann offered. "To resist them is to resist your own destiny," a sibilant alien voice hissed in his moments of weakness. "Embrace the truth, Kâhl. Great power awaits you. This destruction is but a genesis." Kâhl Ghorak fought these creeping shadows in his mind. He was a kin, a being of logic and order. To embrace chaos would be to betray everything the kindred stood for, yet despair sometimes pricked at his conviction. Had the Votann ancestors made an irredeemable error? Was Kindred Khazak-Ur simply doomed no matter how ferociously he fought? Yet, in his bleakest moments, Kâhl Ghorak looked upon the faces of his loyal kin. Jarlath, the steadfast Brokir, toiling relentlessly to keep the vessel operational. Lyra, the young Cori, bravely deciphering the mysteries of the core Votann, even as she grappled with her own fracturing sanity. Durnan, the Hearthkin guard, fighting with the desperation of one who had lost everything, yet still held the line. He saw the stubborn defiance in their eyes, the refusal to yield, and their unshakable loyalty to the kindred. They fought not for glorious victory, but for a humble existence, for a chance to merely survive. It was their unwavering resolve that shored up Kâhl Ghorak's will. He realized he could not falter. He was their Kâhl, and he had to lead them, even if the path ahead was shrouded in perpetual gloom. Faith in the core. Votann might have fractured, but faith in Kindred Khazak-Ur, in the indomitable spirit of the kin, remained. He fought not for the core, Votann, but for the kin who remained, for their legacy. As the Ghorak's vengeance cleaved its way through the Silent Veil, Kâhl Ghorak made a brutal decision. Any kin fully mutated and rendered dangerous would be neutralized without mercy. It was an order he never thought he would issue, but the kindred's survival demanded it. He assembled an elite task force, led by Durnan, to conduct grim purges through the ship's shadowed sectors, hunting down the enlightened abominations and other mutated kin. In a brutal engagement within a derelict cargo bay, Durnan confronted Vorlog, a former broker aide and colleague, now a grotesque creature with a hideous biometallic arm and eyes blazing crimson. Vorlog, his voice a distorted mockery, taunted Durnan, sneering that he was too weak to grasp true power. But Durnan did not waver. He had seen enough corruption. With a roar of fury, he plunged his power axe through Vorlog's chest, ending his wretched existence. Though the act brought searing pain, it was also a grim liberation. Kâhl Ghorak had become a haunted leader, scarred by a shattered kindred, yet possessed of an unnerving resilience. He was no longer the Kâhl of prosperity, but the Kâhl of survival. His personal odyssey had forged him into an icon of sacrifice and grim determination, ready to do anything to safeguard what remained of the kindred, even if it meant confronting horrific truths and making choices no one else dared shoulder. He understood that the burden of a hero was not glory, but perpetual solitude and unending pain. As Kharak's vengeance delved deep into the abyssal core of the silent shroud, the vessel's systems began to scream. Proximity alarms shrieked, warning pict screens flickered with frantic error glyphs, and the ship's Geller field, already weakened by the blighted core Votann, began to buckle perilously. The warp energy boiling outside the hull was no longer a current, but a raging psychic maelstrom, tearing at the fabric of reality itself. Lyra, her eyes rimmed crimson with exhaustion and strain, pointed to a glyph on the star charts. Kâhl, we're here. These are the last known coordinates from Kindred Khazak-Ur's data logs. It's an unnamed metallic world, nestled deep within the nebula's core. The warp signatures, they are extreme, unnaturally, impossibly high. Jarlac, the chief engineer, frantically adjusted auxiliary monitors. The warp energy here is so potent, it's almost materializing. Something is erupting out there. The Geller field won't hold. And then it revealed itself. From behind the sickly-hued nebular clouds, a colossal entity clawed its way into existence. It was no starship, nor any celestial body. It was a mountainous, organic monstrosity, writhing and abhorrent, armed with barbed tentacles and eyes that blazed like living coals. It emanated an overwhelming psychic aura that sent every kin aboard Kharak's vengeance into agonized convulsions. This was a demon prince of chaos, or perhaps a warp entity of even higher, more terrible stature, drawn to the blighted core of Votann, seeing it as a vast larder. It had been waiting for Kindred Khazak-Ur. Kâhl, the colossal warp beast is closing, Durnan roared over the comm link, his voice a desperate blend of terror and resolve. Our pilots are struggling to maintain position, but the ship is being dragged. Kâhl Ghorak felt a chill both colder than the void itself seep into his bones. This was their darkest hour, an enemy against which even their mightiest ancestors would have faltered. This warp beast had been awakened by the blighted core of Votann, and now it sought to devour the kindred whole. All battle stations, prepare for defense. We do not yield, Kâhl Ghorak commanded, his voice booming through the command deck, cutting through the klaxon's shriek. The mothership, Kharak's vengeance, reeled under the impact of the demon prince's crushing tentacles. Thousands of kin were overwhelmed by the warp energy, some collapsing dead in agony, others instantly mutating into grotesque abominations turning on their surviving kin. The internal horror and external assault merged into a living nightmare. Meanwhile, on the unnamed metallic world below where Kindred Khazak-Ur had vanished, Lyra detected another faint signal. Kâhl, it's there, the void energy lock. Its signature emanates from the planet's surface, but we need to get closer. Jarlac, hold the ship steady. Durnan, assemble an elite boarding party. We must reach that planet, Kâhl Ghorak ordered, knowing this was their final gamble. Jarlac and his brokir worked with frenzied determination, striving to prevent Kharak's vengeance from being torn asunder by the demon prince. The vessel's plasma cannons and laser arrays fired without pause, yet they only seared minor wounds into the warp beast's thick organic hide. The demon prince roared in furious defiance, unleashing a wave of psychic energy that crippled the ship's systems and rendered countless kin unconscious. Durnan led the boarding party, comprised of Hearthkin guards and Brokir Ironkin, the kindred's most steadfast warriors. They boarded a single dropship, the last functional craft, and plunged towards the planet below. The craft shuddered violently as it threaded its way through the demon prince's flailing tentacles and the scattered debris of Ghorak's vengeance. Back aboard the mothership, Thanes and the Ascendant kin seized upon the chaos. They believed the demon prince to be the messenger promised by the core of Votann, and that the time had come for the core of Votann to be liberated fully. They surged towards the core of Votann chamber, intent on disabling the remaining seals and fully opening the warp gate. "Never!" Jarlath roared, as he and his broker Ironkin formed a desperate last stand before the core of Votann. He knew that if the core of Votann was consumed by the demon prince, or fully unleashed, the kindred's doom would be sealed. "We will not let you damn us all." In that fraught moment, Kâhl Ghorak stood alone on the command dais. The ship was dying. The foe without was too mighty. The enemy within struck at the very heart of the kindred, and their last desperate hope hurtled towards an unnamed world. He watched the demon prince roar its triumph, preparing to land the killing blow upon Ghorak's vengeance. "For the kindred, for Khazak-Ur!" Kâhl Ghorak cried, his voice ringing across the ship's voxcasters, a desperate blend of defiance and despair. He knew he had to buy time for Durnan's boarding party. He knew there was only one path left. Kindred Khazak-Ur's most desperate battle had begun. Between a fracturing kindred, a dying vessel, and a colossal entity of chaos, their only hope was a faint glimmer from a forgotten world. As the colossal demon prince let loose a horrifying roar, poised to deliver a killing blow to Ghorak's vengeance, Kâhl Ghorak knew he had but one choice. He had to buy time for Durnan and the landing party on the planet below. It was a terrible sacrifice, a decision that would seal his fate, and perhaps that of the entire kindred. "Jarlath, Lyra," Kâhl Ghorak roared into the comms, his voice echoing with grim resolve. "Protect the core of Votann at all costs. And Lyra, continue to guide Durnan. I will hold the beast at bay." Without another word, Kâhl Ghorak surged towards the auxiliary control room of the vessel, where an emergency console for the main defensive systems remained active. With a prodigious effort, he wrestled the controls of Ghorak's vengeance, turning the ship's prow towards the demon prince like a wounded leviathan charging its predator. Then he did what no Kâhl had ever dared. He initiated the vessel's core overload protocol. Ghorak's vengeance's plasma reactors began to shriek in a frenzy, blue-white plumes of energy erupting from its exhausts. The ship shuddered violently, circuits arcing with raw power. Jarlath, witnessing this from the core Votann sector, reeled in horror. "No, Kâhl, you cannot. The ship will explode." "This is our only hope, Jarlath," Kâhl Ghorak roared back, his voice strained with exertion. "Protect the kindred. I trust you all." The demon prince, sensing the titanic surge of energy from Ghorak's vengeance, paused, its crimson eyes burning with fury and a flicker of surprise. It had not expected such defiance from a weakened prey. Kâhl Ghorak, his will forged from adamantium, poured every ounce of his remaining strength into piloting the vessel, transforming Ghorak's vengeance into a colossal guided bomb. Meanwhile, on the metallic world below, Durnan and his landing party faced unexpected resistance. The planet was not entirely abandoned. What remained of Kindred Khazak-Ur, or their mutated descendants, had become savage guardians of the relic they once safeguarded. They were biomechanical entities, their forms warped with twisted machinery, and their eyes glowing with the baleful green light of the warp, snarling blasphemous utterances. Durnan and his squad fought their way through a labyrinth of ruined metallic structures and dark corridors, confronting foes that poured endlessly from the shadows. They had witnessed what transpired aboard Ghorak's vengeance via their comm screens. The burning ship, Kâhl Ghorak sacrificing himself to buy them time. That sight had imbued them with an unyielding will. Lyra, still aboard the landing craft, employed her skills to decipher residual signals from the core Votann and ancient records of Kindred Khazak-Ur. She pinpointed the location of the vacuum energy lock, deep within an ancient metallic catacomb, guarded by long, obsolete energy shields. "Durnan, the catacomb is there. We must hurry. Kâhl Ghorak he's sacrificing himself for us," Lyra cried out, her eyes glistening with tears. With a furious roar, Durnan surged forward, leading his squad. He no longer thought of pain or loss. He thought only of Kâhl Ghorak's sacrifice and the survival of the kindred. They finally reached the entrance to the catacomb, where they confronted a monstrous, corrupted warrior, the remnants of Kâhl Ghorak himself, twisted and interred within a grotesque mechanized suit of armor to guard the relic. Meanwhile, aboard Ghorak's vengeance, Kâhl Ghorak faced imminent annihilation. The ship burned around him, its systems collapsing. He felt the dreadful heat of the surging plasma energy consuming every section of the vessel. The demon prince, finally comprehending Kâhl Ghorak's grim intent, bellowed in furious protest, attempting to recoil, but it was already too late. With a final defiant cry, "For Khazak-Ur, for the Kindred!" Kâhl Ghorak triggered the final stage of the overload sequence. Ghorak's vengeance erupted in a blinding nova of plasma and warp energy, creating a colossal stellar explosion. The demon prince was engulfed in the inferno of fire and energy, its roars of agony drowned out by the apocalyptic blast. Several of its tentacles were torn asunder, and its gargantuan form was hurled backwards, grievously wounded. The explosion carved a temporary void in the warp storm, granting the landing party a precious opportunity. On the planet, Durnan grappled with Jarkul's colossal warrior. He fought with every ounce of his strength, knowing every second was precious. Finally, with a decisive blow, he struck down the Guardian. Within the catacomb, the faint luminescence of a unique crystal emanated. It was the vacuum energy lock, a multifaceted crystal shimmering with ethereal colors. It pulsed with a strange energy field, both serene and potent. Jarlath, aboard the landing craft, watched the immolation of Ghorak's vengeance with profound grief. He had lost his Kâhl, lost their mothership. But Kâhl Ghorak's sacrifice had granted them a final chance. He looked at the vacuum energy lock in Lyra's hands. "We must return to the core Votann immediately." With the vacuum energy lock secured, and the agony of Kâhl Ghorak's sacrifice etched into their souls, what remained of Kindred Khazak-Ur had gained a fragile hope. Yet the path ahead remained fraught with peril, for the demon prince, though wounded, still lived, and the whispers of the warp echoed ceaselessly. The cataclysmic detonation of Ghorak's vengeance had ripped a terrifying void in space, yet it had also forged a precious opportunity. The demon prince, though grievously wounded and roaring in agony, still lived, but it had been repelled, and the warp storm coiling around it had temporarily receded. Durnan and the boarding party, clutching the voidlock key, hastily retreated to their sole remaining dropship, the full weight of Kâhl Ghorak's loss and their beloved mothership's destruction heavy upon them. Grief mingled with a fierce primal resolve to survive. As the dropship streaked towards the core Votann chamber, Jarlath and Lyra were met with a horrifying tableau. The entire sector surrounding the core Votann aboard Ghorak's vengeance was a charnel house of devastation. Countless Brochir Ironkin and Hearthkin guards had fallen in the brutal struggle against Thanes and his enlightened aberrants. Yet Jarlath and his loyal Brochir had managed to hold the line, though at a terrible cost. Jarlath himself was grievously wounded, portions of his armor rent and shattered, yet he stood defiantly, an unyielding bastion. Thanes, his form utterly corrupted and eyes burning with a sickly green light, was striving to breach the core of Votann's final seals. He believed the recent explosion to be a sign, an affirmation that the core of Votann yearned to be liberated entirely. He and his enlightened aberrants had transformed the core of Votann chamber into a blasphemous shrine, performing vile rituals of blood and mutated kinflesh, convinced this would empower the nascent warp gate. "Never!" Durnan roared, as he and his team burst into the chamber, hurtling into battle against Thanes and the remaining mutated cultists. The battle erupted anew, savage and unyielding. While Durnan fought, Lyra, clutching the voidlock key tightly, surged towards the core of Votann. She knew this was their only chance. Guided by Jarlath's instructions, she located the hidden access point mentioned in the ancient records, a concealed slot within the core of Votann's outer shell, expressly designed to receive the voidlock key. As Lyra struggled to insert the crystal, Thanes caught sight of her actions. With a bestial roar of fury, he lunged at Lyra, his hands transforming into razor-sharp talons, ready to tear her apart. "You will not shatter our evolution," he shrieked. Durnan, perceiving the imminent danger, lunged to intercept Thanes, but was contemptuously hurled aside. In that critical instant, Jarlath, despite his wounds, swung his remaining power hammer, striking Thanes with a mighty blow that sent him reeling. That precious moment was all Lyra needed. With a gasp, Lyra slammed the voidlock key into its socket. Instantly, the core of Votann reacted with cataclysmic force. A potent wave of energy erupted from the crystal, coursing through the entire core of Votann and radiating outwards through the ship. It was not a destructive surge, but a wave of stabilizing, calming, yet immensely powerful psychic nullification. The insidious whispers of the warp, abruptly silenced. Illusions dissolved into nothingness. The lightly mutated kin suddenly collapsed, writhing in agony, their very souls seemingly torn between realities. Thanes and his enlightened aberrants shrieked in torment as the Voidlock Key's energy lanced through their corrupted forms, purging or obliterating what they had become. The core Votann was sealed. The nascent warp gate still existed, a horrifying scar, but it was now firmly locked, no longer bleeding chaotic energies into the kindred. As the dust settled, a chilling silence fell over the dropship. The surviving mutated kin lay immobile, contorted in agony, or had simply died. Thanes lay motionless, his body racked with residual spasms. The core Votann, though no longer spewing warp energy, now bore a strange countenance. Fine cracks, shimmering with the Voidlock Key's azure energy, had bloomed across its metallic surface. Yet the scars of corruption and the blasphemous glyphs etched by Thanes remained deeply ingrained. What remained of Kindred Khazak-Ur had survived, but the cost was unfathomable. Kâhl Ghorak was dead, Khorac's vengeance utterly destroyed, thousands of kin slain or irreversibly twisted. The planet Khazak-Ur was now a dead world, left behind for its core Votann to rot in corruption until its inevitable self-destruction. Jarlac, his injured form leaning heavily, met the gazes of Lyra and Durnan. A profound sorrow etched their eyes, yet a flicker of grim relief was also present. They had done it. They had snatched the kindred from utter annihilation, but the repercussions of this catastrophe would echo through their lineage forever. Kindred Khazak-Ur was now but a wraith of its former self, surviving on a solitary dropship, adrift in the chilling expanse of the stillness mists. Isolated, weakened, and burdened by the crushing weight of their losses, their core Votann, though sealed, was no longer the fount of immutable knowledge it once was. It was a relic of catastrophe, a painful testament to the grim price of survival. Yet, they endured. They had won a battle, if not the war, but the path ahead stretched long and treacherous, and the dread of what still lurked within the heart of their knowledge would forever haunt them. The fate of Kindred Khazak-Ur was no glorious triumph, but a tragic saga of desperate survival and unhealing scars. Following Kâhl Ghorak's sacrifice and the activation of the Voidlock, Kindred Khazak-Ur endured, but at an unimaginable cost. They had become a shattered kindred, isolated and forever haunted by dreadful memories. Jarlac, the chief engineer, with fresh scars etched upon his body and soul, reluctantly assumed the mantle of Kâhl, leading what remained of the kindred. A pragmatist, he understood that the kindred had changed forever. He led the survivors aboard the sole operational landing craft, a makeshift fortress adrift in the void. Their objective was no longer prosperity, but bare survival. They wandered through distant reaches of space, shunning other kindreds, for they carried a secret too dreadful to share. Lyra, the young Cori, now elevated to the rank of Chief Cori, was the only one who could commune with the sealed core Votann. The heart of knowledge was no longer the fount of clear and abundant wisdom it once was. It had grown more silent, more enigmatic, bearing the indelible scars of corruption. Though the Voidlock had stemmed the flow of the warp, Lyra still sensed the presence of a nascent warp gate within the core Votann. It was like a beast slumbering, yet poised to awaken at any moment. Lyra dedicated her life to monitoring the core Votann, striving to decipher the twisted remnants of its data, hoping to find warnings or forgotten shards of knowledge that might aid her kindred's survival. The warp's insidious whispers and visions still occasionally pierced her mind, a searing reminder of what had transpired. She became the kindred's secret keeper, the heavy burden of truth weighing upon her. Durnan, the stalwart Hearthkin guard, became Jarlac's most trusted Hearthkin. He led the remaining Hearthkin warriors, bearing physical and psychic wounds. They no longer fought with the proud confidence of their forebears, but with wary caution and a deep-seated hatred. They had witnessed their brethren twist into monstrosities, and that scar would never heal. They became the most vigilant, forever seeking signs of corruption within their own ranks, and amongst other kindreds they might chance upon. They carried a fierce resolve to never let it happen again. The legacy of Kindred Khazak-Ur was no glory or grand achievement. It was a tragic warning, a horrific tale whispered in hushed tones amongst other kindreds. Some loyalist Cori from other kindreds recorded reports of the Khazak-Ur incident, but the majority of this information remained suppressed. for the truth of a core of Votann's potential corruption was too shattering to the kin's fundamental beliefs. Yet, in the closed conclaves of guild stewards and Cori elders, the name of Kindred Khazak-Ur was spoken as a grim reminder of the unimaginable perils lurking within their oldest legacies. The surviving kin, lightly afflicted and partially purified by the void, Locke's activation, were now trapped between worlds. They were no longer wholly controlled by chaos, but their physical and mental alterations were permanent. Their skins still bore strange discolored patches, their eyes gleamed with unnatural lights, and sometimes the whispers of the warp still echoed within their minds, a spectral resonance. They lived in isolation, feared by other kin, and tormented by memories of the atrocities they had committed under chaos's sway. Kindred Khazak-Ur never truly recovered. They remained a perpetual warning, a marked kindred bearing the indelible scars of their transformation. They never found a new homeworld, condemned to drift through the void like phantoms of a tragic past. Their core Votann, once a fount of knowledge and life, now stood a silent monument to catastrophe, a symbol of betrayal and corruption. When a new kin is born, they are no longer brought before the core Votann for the initial blessing. They are instead told the tale of Khazak-Ur, a tragic story of betrayed trust, of corruption from within, and of the terrible cost of survival. Their legacy is one of perpetual vigilance, an unceasing dread of what truly lurks within their hearts of knowledge, and a silent vow that they will never allow another kindred to suffer a similar fate. They are living, agonizing proof that even the most unyielding foundations can crumble before the madness of chaos.